Deep in Appalachia, there are places where the earth whispers, where cold, clean water moves through the mountain like blood through old bones, silent, invisible, ancient. And the families who lived in these hollows, they heard it, they followed it, they built their entire lives around it. Outsiders who visited these mountain homesteads always noticed the same thing. The water was different here, cold in the heat of August, clean when valley water ran brown, steady when drought cracked the lowland soil into dust. They couldn't explain it. But the mountain families didn't need to explain it. They had lived beside this water for generations, and they had learned, slowly, carefully, across lifetimes, exactly what it could do. These mountains are older than memory. The Appalachians were ancient when the first human beings walked this continent, worn down by time, softened by rain, layered deep with stone and clay, and the slow movement of underground water that has never stopped, not once in 10,000 years. And beneath every hollow, beneath every ridge, beneath every flat piece of ground where a family dared to build a cabin, the water moved. Not in rivers, not in creeks you could see, but through the rock itself, through seams of sandstone and limestone that acted like hidden pipes laid by the earth long before any man ever picked up a tool. The mountain families understood this world intimately. They had to. Because in these hollows, far from any town, far from any well digger, far from any system a government or county might provide, the only water that kept your family alive was the water you found yourself, and finding it was an art. But finding it was only the beginning. What they did with it after, that's what most people never knew. Before a single log was cut for a cabin wall, before a single stone was laid for a hearth, the mountain family walked to the land. For days sometimes, weeks, they were looking for one thing above everything else, the spring. Not every piece of ground had one. A man who built his home in the wrong hollow might spend his whole life hauling water from a creek a quarter-mile down the slope, a back-breaking daily labor that wore out men and women before their time. But a family who found a true spring, they had found something worth more than good soil, more than good timber, more than any other feature the land could offer. They had found a living system, already built, already working, already cold and clean and reliable in a way that nothing man-made could match. The old mountain people knew how to read the signs. A cluster of watercress growing in a low spot where nothing else was planted, that was a sign. A line of bright green moss running along a hillside in an otherwise dry August, that was a sign. A place where the ground stayed soft and dark-colored long after rain had dried everywhere else, that was a sign. The mountain was always speaking. The question was whether you knew how to listen. And once they found the spring, what they built around it changed everything about how that family lived. Picture this: a hillside, somewhere in the Blue Ridge, or the Cumberlands, or the deep hollows of West Virginia, a place where cold water seeps out of the earth so quietly you might mistake it for morning dew. A mountain man kneels there, puts his hand into the soil, feels the cold pushing up through the clay. He doesn't say anything. He just nods. Within days, sometimes weeks, a structure begins to take shape in that spot. Stones, carefully chosen, flat on their faces, tight against each other, fitted without mortar in the oldest tradition. A box, roughly 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep, built directly over the place where the water emerged from the earth. The bottom lined with gravel, clean gravel, washed twice in the creek, fine enough to filter, coarse enough to let the water through. The top covered, sometimes with a heavy flat stone, sometimes with fitted timber, always sealed tight enough to keep out leaves, insects, animals, anything that might foul what was inside. This was the spring box. And what it did was so simple it almost defies explanation. It captured the spring at its source, before the water could spread and warm and pick up the soil and debris of the open ground. It held the water at its coldest, its cleanest, its most perfect. The temperature inside a well-built spring box stayed between 42 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit through the hottest summer months. Not because of ice, not because of machinery, because the earth itself held that temperature at that depth, and the spring box simply preserved it. But the spring box was only part of what the mountain families built. The water didn't just sit there. It moved, and they moved with it. Here is where the old mountain engineering becomes something remarkable. The spring box was almost never built level with the cabin. It was built above it, uphill, sometimes just 20 feet, sometimes 100, but always higher than the homestead below. Because the mountain families understood, without textbooks, without engineering school, without any formal knowledge of hydraulics, that water moves downhill. And if water moves downhill, then water can be made to work. From the spring box, a wooden trough was laid. Hollowed-out logs, poplar was common, sometimes black walnut, fitted end to end, sealed at the joints with clay or pine pitch. Down the slope it ran, following the natural fall of the land, turning where the terrain turned, dropping where the terrain dropped. Into the cabin yard, into the kitchen if the slope allowed it, into a secondary holding trough near the smokehouse, running water, constant, cold, gravity-fed, no pump, no power, no maintenance beyond clearing leaves in the fall, just the mountain doing what the mountain had always done, moving water from high places to low places, and a family wise enough to place themselves in the right position to receive it. Think about what that meant for daily life. No hauling buckets from a distant creek in the dark of January, no breaking ice to reach water in February, no praying that the nearest water source hadn't gone foul in August heat. The water came to them, clean, cold, constant. But the true genius of this system wasn't the water coming in. It was what they did with the water once it arrived. Just outside the cabin, sometimes carved into the kitchen wall itself, sat a trough. Not decorative, not ceremonial. A working cold storage vessel fed directly by the spring water flowing down from the hillside. On a July morning, a mountain woman might place a crock of fresh milk into that trough before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge. The spring water, 46 degrees, cold enough to make your hand ache, ran continuously around it. By midday, when the air above the hollow shimmered with summer heat and the garden rose when dry between waterings, that milk was still cold, still fresh, still good for the children who would drink it at supper. Butter sat in the cold trough, soft cheeses, eggs in seasons when the hens laid more than the family could use, leftover cooked meat on nights when the smokehouse stores were being saved for later in winter. The cold trough was, in every meaningful sense, the Appalachian refrigerator. Running water. Stone-lined. Gravity-fed from a hillside spring that never warmed, never stopped, never asked for anything in return. It required no electricity because the mountain provided the cold. It required no ice because the spring never reached freezing. It required no maintenance beyond what any careful family would give naturally to the thing keeping their food alive. And there was one more detail to the system, one that most visitors to these homesteads completely missed, one that took generations to understand and only minutes to lose. The spring water didn't just stop at the cold trough, it kept moving. The mountain families designed their water systems with overflow in mind, always. Water that had passed through the cold trough flowed onward, down another carved trough or stone channel, out toward the garden, toward the small orchard, toward the herb beds that lined the south-facing slope below the cabin. Nothing wasted, nothing still. The water that kept the butter cold in the morning was watering the bean rows by afternoon. This is the detail that modern eyes tend to miss when they look at old Appalachian homestead layouts. The placement of the cabin, the placement of the spring, the slope of the ground between them, the location of the garden below. It wasn't random, it was a system, designed not in a single afternoon, but refined across generations of watching what worked and what didn't. Of a grandfather showing a son where to place the spring box. Of a mother teaching a daughter how to read the overflow and redirect it when the summer garden needed it most. Knowledge passed the way all the deepest. Knowledge passed the way all the deepest knowledge passes. Not written down, not stored in books, lived, practiced, handed from one set of careful hands to another. And when that chain broke, when the children left for the cities and the grandchildren never came back to the hollow, the knowledge went with them, quietly, without ceremony. Like water disappearing into dry ground, there is one last thing worth understanding about these mountain water systems, something beyond the cold, beyond the convenience, beyond the engineering. The water that came from these deep mountain springs was different from surface water in ways the mountain families understood long before any laboratory confirmed it. It had been filtered, moving through layers of sandstone and limestone and clay for years, sometimes decades, before it ever reached the surface. Every impurity strained out by the earth itself, every particle of sediment left behind in the slow passage through rock. What emerged at the spring head was water that had been purified by the mountain over more time than any man-made filtration system could replicate. The mountain families didn't have the vocabulary for this, but they had the evidence. Families who drank spring water stayed healthier than those who drew from open creeks. Children raised on springbox water had fewer of the waterborne illnesses that swept through lowland communities with devastating regularity. They didn't know why, they just knew it was true. And so they built their lives around the spring the way other civilizations built their lives around rivers. With reverence, with care, with a deep understanding that the water was not simply a resource. It was the reason they were alive. Most of these spring boxes are silent now, but the springs themselves, the springs never stopped. Today, if you walk the old homestead roads of Appalachia, the ones that have gone back to dirt, back to gravel, back to grass growing up through the middle, and you stop in the right hollow, and you stand still long enough, you'll hear it beneath the ferns, beneath the moss-covered stones, beneath the collapsed walls of a spring box that held cold water for a family 150 years ago. The water is still moving, still cold, still clean, still emerging from the same seam of limestone it has always emerged from. The family is gone. The cabin is gone. The wooden troughs rotted back into the forest floor decades ago, but the spring remains. Because the mountain doesn't forget, the mountain doesn't need to be reminded of what it knows. It simply continues, slow and patient and cold, doing what it has always done, moving water from the deep places to the surface, offering it quietly to anyone wise enough to kneel down and receive it. The old mountain families understood something we have spent a century forgetting, that the most powerful systems are not the ones we build. They are the ones we find and learn carefully, humbly, across generations, how to live beside.